Wanna play a game that's really challenging?
Like what?
Like Bop It! It commands,
Cool.
you obey!
Pop it. Twist it. Pull it.
Once you get your hands on Bop It, you're not gonna wanna stop it!
This artifact. Incredible.
Tempestfall was a 2021 VR game set in Warhammer's Age of Sigmar universe. It was produced by the Polish Carbon Studio, who are best known for their in-house VR franchise, The Wizards, which is a critically acclaimed spell combat series. A perfect fit for the high fantasy Age of Sigmar setting. I really tried hard to like Tempestfall. I think people tend to be overly harsh on VR titles, but I quite like this emerging little corner of gaming. And I understand that we can't really compare these games to AAA titles. VR's just not big enough for that. Some of my viewers probably remember my review of Battle Sister, where I raved about how much I loved it, despite all the rough edges. Despite being made by totally different studios, it's impossible to not compare Tempestfall to Battle Sister, considering they are both Warhammer VR titles and were released only a year apart. Now, Warhammer Age of Sigmar is much less well known when you compare it to Warhammer 40k. Although both are tabletop war games, one is essentially a colossal multimedia franchise that has invaded the minds of millions. The other is basically just a tabletop war game with a few multimedia pieces that haven't gotten very popular. And this has ended up being quite a strange circumstance, because games like Vermintide and Warhammer Total War have created a surprising amount of pop culture awareness of the now dead Warhammer fantasy setting that Age of Sigmar replaced. And by replaced, I mean knifed in a back alley. So, with this being a smaller franchise than I usually cover, it's worth taking a second to explain what Age of Sigmar is. Warhammer Fantasy is the OG Warhammer from 1983, that Warhammer 40k is actually a spin-off of, and it even takes some of the lore, like the Chaos Gods. It's a reasonably well-liked franchise, but it never managed to capture the same mass audience the way the dystopian sci-fi version did. As the years went on, it became a less and less profitable setting, until the year reached 2015 and Games Workshop hatched the most batshit insane plan to reinvigorate interest in the Warhammer fantasy setting. They blew it the fuck up.
You maniac!
In an event called the End Times, Chaos won, everyone fucking died, and the winds of magic split apart, shattering the entire world into a series of new and interconnected planes of existence. You can perhaps understand why a lot of Warhammer Fantasy fans did not like this very much. However, this whole gamble, as wild as it may seem, actually ended up working out, because Age of Sigmar is, in fact, way more profitable than Warhammer Fantasy Battles ever was, and most of the anger has kind of finally wound down. Up till now, I've never actually gone and checked out the setting, because it felt a lot like a sequel to Lord of the Rings, where Middle-earth got struck by a planet-cracking meteor, and then becomes a series of fantasy asteroids plummeting through the void. All this to say is that I'm a bit of a stranger here. What I do know is that Sigmar, the human god from Warhammer Fantasy, more or less put the Shattered Realms back to some semblance of order, until screaming until his eyes bled when the forces of chaos swarmed all over it again. He then sicked his Stormcast Eternals across the plains in a never-ending war against the reincarnated versions of all the factions from Warhammer Fantasy. I would describe it, from the outside looking in, like this. All of Sigmar's horses and all of Sigmar's men try to put a FromSoft world back together again. Last piece of the puzzle we're required to understand before we get in the game: what's a Stormcast Eternal? These are the fragments of heroic souls, often slain in combat, but not always, that Sigmar has snatched up and then forged into gold-plated killing machines, their souls forever returning to be reforged when they're slain. I think this is supposed to be cool, or a good thing in some way, but honestly, being eternally reincarnated into a fantasy meat grinder and hammered back into being on God's anvil sounds like one of the worst things I can actually imagine. So, hi, you've made it a couple minutes into this video now, so I'd like to let you know that this video was brought to you by the patrons. This channel is all about the various video game adaptations of tabletop properties. So if you want to support that effort, then Patreon is pretty much the best way to help. You'll gain access to a patrons-only podcast where I bring on guests every month to talk about video games, role-playing games, and more. Plus, you'll appear in the credits at the end of every video. That's neat. Anyway, we're playing as one of these Stormcast Eternals in Tempestfall, or more specifically, we're playing as a Lord Arcanum, who were wizards before they got reforged. Ooh. We spawn into the world, having just been slain on some battlefield or another, and a big talking head tells us that our soul has been diminished in death. But constantly dying and slowly draining away to nothing each time we die is no excuse for idleness, so we get sent to the Death Realm, Shyish, to investigate why the Stormcast Eternals posted there haven't been returning to the Forge when they die. Will this be a hard task? Apparently not, because the game tells me that if I pick any difficulty other than easy, they're just gonna refuse to give me the tutorial. After hobbling through the entrance, it doesn't take very long to notice how bad this game looks on the Quest 2. Some stuff is high res, mostly your hands and weapons, but the rest of the game looks noticeably rough. I mean, this was true of Battle Sister too, but not to this level, and they went and repolished it after launch. Now, this could be my fault for playing the Quest 2 version. I didn't know going in that this was a port of the PC version, which looks much better. Still, let it be known that the textures are inexcusably bad on the Quest 2. It should not have launched like this. And the fact that they haven't polished up these textures in the 2 years that it's been out like Battle Sister did, honestly, it's a bad look. Sometimes games without incredible graphical power can get by on sheer art direction alone, but I don't feel like it's there in this game. For starters, in a medium that struggles with muddy textures, the decision to set this game on the plane of death, where everything is obviously going to be tones of ill-defined brown and gray, I'm just gonna say, I don't respect that choice. But the game does still have a few times when it can show off, because the artists who designed this were clearly not bad at their jobs in any way. I think they were probably just stretched thin. Some locations just look like garbage, especially dungeons, while others have clearly had a lot of care put into fine crafting the immense scale. Still though, you'll be spending most of your time in areas that don't look very good, so that's not great. All in all, it comes together okay on the PC where the textures and lighting effects are better, but yeah, it looks so bad on the Quest 2 that I legitimately think they shouldn't have released this version. Normally I talk a bit about the sound alongside the graphics, but I'm gonna be extra brief on that section today. I caught a bit of a bug during my stress jogs during the making of my Space Hulk video, and my ears are congested, not my nose. It's weird. Anyway, I am essentially half deaf right now until it clears, meaning that most of the sound work was lost on me. I will say that I found the music to be decent, and it reinforced the tone at key moments.
Bring order and deliver justice. In the name of Sigmar!
The combat sounds are decent too. I complained in Battle Sister how the melee SFX weren't quite good enough to lend the needed impact to make, swords and stuff feel good to use. That's a non-issue in Tempestfall though, with your lightning-powered weapons and spells all sounding exactly as you would want them to. Outside of combat though, it doesn't feel like a lot of effort was paid to the sound. I mean, I want a noisy crackling torch. And sometimes you have to hit random objects with your sword and it never sounds correct. Okay, so it's probably gameplay time, isn't it? Let's talk gameplay. The game gives you 3 decent weapons, and a torch that you can use to ineffectually smack skeletons with. Each weapon can unlock 3 different associated spells that can be further upgraded at the forge. The spells are all pretty easy to activate, requiring only that you hold down the trigger and then move your weapon in the required way, either thrusting it, slashing, or raising it above your head. Variety here isn't too bad, and you'll end up with a reasonable number of options in combat. It's clear that this is where the dev, who, I remind you, was best known for making a VR magic slinging game, really shines. In this case, I'm afraid they don't shine too brightly though. The game feels pretty decent as you're still unlocking spells on your main weapon, but once you've got it all unlocked, it doesn't take long before everything starts to blur together. This is made worse by the lack of enemy variety. The main enemy you'll be fighting are these floating ghost guys called Night Haunts. And when you start unlocking more enemies, it's almost always a new type of Night Haunt with a bigger health pool. Or extra big Night Haunts that summon more Night Haunts. This is a game that takes around 10 hours to beat, but it's got the gameplay variety of more like a 5-hour game, and it gets a bit dry in the second half. The melee's worth bringing up too. You don't have an infinite number of spells, so you'll need to mix it up and get stuck in pretty frequently. I found that the sword had some fun spells that gave the swordplay more options than other VR games I've played, plus the enemies feel fun to spar with, and their attacks are well telegraphed, so you have plenty of time to parry. Altogether, it's a competently made melee system, except when it isn't. It's a bit glitchy, and there are a lot of times when you have clearly parried an attack, but the enemy just hits you anyway. And this happens pretty frequently. It kind of means that you just can't really rely on parrying, because a lot of the time the game will just arbitrarily decide whether it worked or not. And the other issue is this: the game chooses to just black your screen entirely when there's anything clipping into your camera. I presume this was to protect your immersion in some way, but it actually created a much worse problem. Enemies will constantly clip into you during combat, thus blinding you. The cure, in this case, is much more harmful than the disease. With how many extra bonus quests and missions are in this game, I'm left with the feeling that a bit too much effort was put into broadening Tempestfall when the core fundamentals were not there yet. Now, with combat out of the way, we can talk about the rest of the controls. For the most part, they're the standard stuff you'll see in most VR games. A little climbing, a little lever pulling, puzzles, etc. I did find this to be a little bit below the par of what I expect from VR games though. Lots of things required really awkward gestures, especially doorways. And you'll also notice that a lot of things trigger that weird clipping animation that really should not, like when you're trying to burn away vines with a torch. But what really got me was the grip. The game was so focused on telling you, here is how you're supposed to grip things and hold it in your hands, that they ignore the way your hands actually grab them. So a lot of the time you'll just grab a lever and your hands will twist around backwards. It's not gonna ruin the game, but it does negate most of that VR feeling of being able to reach out and touch things. You know, that tactile stuff that makes the medium so unique. These never feel like they're your hands, because the game's just so strict on how you can use them. Which I could have forgiven if this was the studio's first go into VR, but this is a VR studio. You may recall from my Battle Sister review that the inventory play was actually my favorite part of that game. That lovely feeling of manually reaching for my guns and tearing out mags. Well, that's almost entirely gone in Tempestfall. Your gear isn't on your body this time. It appears in your fist every time you close your hands, and that's okay. Swapping gear is instead done in some very clumsy radial menus. Come on, just let me pull the sword off my back, please, that would be so fucking cool. Why do you hate fun? Mind you, the one piece of inventory play we did get was gear upgrading. You don't hit an upgrade button. You take a goddamned hammer and you reforge the damn thing with your own 2 hands. This was unironically my favorite gameplay feature. Now for the most important part of VR, the comfort settings. Now this is actually a bit hard for me to gauge, in part because using comfort settings like the vignette tends to completely ruin gameplay footage, so I can't really use a lot of them. But that was true in Battle Sister too, and I felt pretty decent during that game. In Tempestfall, on the other hand, I was perpetually nauseous. Now, some of this is not the game's fault. I haven't touched my Oculus since October, when a certain lizard in human skin cheerfully welcomed me into his metaverse. Something which I would rather die than be a part of. Anyway, point is, I lost my VR legs, and I can't blame that on Tempestfall. But what I can blame on Tempestfall is how inconsiderate the level design is of your nausea levels. When you're designing VR games, it's important to remember that the majority of your players can only play for a short period of time. Gameplay, therefore, needs to be divided up into 30 to 45 minute chunks, so that most people aren't fighting vomit to finish a level, or left feeling like they finished their goal early and didn't get to use their whole time slot. Tempestfall pays this absolutely no heed whatsoever. Not only do the quests and dungeons all vary massively in length, but there's also a semi-open world to worry about. Open world is probably too generous of a term. You walk around the city of Dreadheim entering dungeons and stuff. And once you've found the dungeon you're entering, I personally would get pretty trepidatious, because, like, I could only go for another 25 minutes or so before I started to feel like shit, so I'd be standing at the doorway wondering, is this gonna be a short dungeon, or is this like an hour and a half kind of thing? There was just no way to know, and I often had to abandon dungeons in the home stretch because I just reached my absolute limit. So yeah, the game made me very sick very frequently. It wasn't a comfort setting thing, it was the fact that they didn't format the game with sessions in mind. Now, in a good VR game, I could accept the nausea. But here's why I think in Tempestfall it wasn't really worth it. The gameplay is, as I've stated, probably okay. I would call it like good enough for the most part, needs polish, right? But the story doesn't make up for it at all. It actually feels like it has zero stakes. Everyone is already dead, and nothing we are doing matters. We have arrived on the plane of death, and there actually used to be a local population here, but not anymore. A universe-shattering event called the Necroquake killed the locals, and we never meet a single soul who isn't a Stormcast Eternal. Our Lord Arcanum arrives, and soon realizes that his troops he was dispatched with have been captured, and are now being sacrificed in front of his eyes by a necromancer. And I will remind you now, this is my first brush with Age of Sigmar, so this encounter felt like kind of a logic puzzle to understand if I'm supposed to care about this or not. So the only real piece of lore I knew at this time was that these Stormcast Eternals are reforged after death, and these guys have just died, right? So they're gonna get reforged, so this is probably fine, right? Except the Necromancer is interfering in some way, so I guess they're just like their regular person dead, so that's bad. But wait, he actually like took their souls. Is that in any way meaningfully different from what Sigmar does? The game is implying that this is a bad thing, so I guess it must be a bad thing. Do I care? I think I'm supposed to, but I have no skin in this game. I don't know these characters at all. In terms of setting up stakes, it's very muddled. And honestly, I think this game is a terrible entryway into the Age of Sigmar series. Not a lot of this world gets explained, and what does get explained is so Sigmar-centric that it sounds like a 7-year-old explaining why their action figure is the coolest. Wow, Sigmar is so great! He's gonna save the world! Is he? What world? The one Sigmar made. Isn't he great? Oh, he made the world? Well, what's this world like that he made? Well, Sigmar ruled over it, and he made Stormcast Eternals to protect it. Okay, you're not telling me about the world. You're just telling me more about Sigmar. Why should I care about this world? Well, because Sigmar... And I don't know enough to denounce the setting as a whole. I'm sure Age of Sigmar is fleshed out elsewhere, there's novels, etc., but it sure doesn't get fleshed out well enough in Tempestfall. We get a whole lot about the people who are going to save the world, and almost nothing about the world itself. And all of this, by the way, doesn't get given to us diegetically through like dialogue or in-game stuff. It's all done through journal entries that we find and we have to, manually read, which is actually the last thing I want to be doing in VR. Ultimately, we have been sent to save a city we know nothing about, where all of the people are already dead. And honestly, there's a huge missed opportunity here, because the main character is actually from this plane. So there's a lot of opportunities for like integrated storytelling, but all we actually get is a bunch of stuff where he's like, I remember this.
Athenium's great hull brings back memories.
It feels like we aren't saving anything. We're just acting like heroes. And, credit where it's due, I guess. The game doesn't make saving the city to be, like, any form of stakes in this game. Like, that's not that important. The objective is more about saving your fellow Stormcast Eternals who had their souls stolen. But, like, why were they here? Can't we just leave instead of getting into this pissing match over an empty chunk of reality? Everyone is dead, and I'm not convinced that any of this actually matters. And I get it. Okay, there's some lore saying that, Nagash, the god of death, he did the necroquake, it affected everybody all over. But again, we get a whole bunch about, Nagash hurt the world, and we're saving the world. What world? Moving on. I'm not going to cover most of the plot beats, because I just don't think most of it's important, but I will outline the key bits. The start of anything that substantially affects the plot is that as we explore Dredheim, there are a lot of inaccessible areas. Eventually, we come across a forbidden boppet that can selectively reverse time to help navigate the zone. I kinda like this little thing. It's fun to pull apart, but I feel like there was room for more. I joked that it was a boppet, but frankly, I would have liked it more if it was closer to being a boppet. If different puzzles had to be solved by manipulating this weird little object in different ways, that would have been really cool. Anyway, the Boppet of Doom leads us to the top of a magic academy, and we use it to locate the necromancer who has stolen the souls. We then dispose of the Boppet exactly like I did decades ago when I discovered the Game Boy Advance. And then we head off to a dark marsh to chase our foe. The protagonist tells us that there's a strange energy in the bog, and it's probably the sign of something called a penumbral engine, an artifact made by Sigmar to alter the mind in order to hide the existence of great artifacts hidden inside of storm vaults. And I don't really have any snark here. I like everything to do with the penumbral engine. It's a cool piece of lore, and it elevated the game's climax. We first need to track down a fragment of the engine just to be able to find our way to its chamber. Once we've reached it, we get one of the best damned VR dungeon crawls I've ever experienced. This thing fucks you up in ways that could only work in VR. Things change and warp when you look away, and it's actually fucking terrifying. This is such a great dungeon, and I loved every second of it. But I also have to wonder, why wasn't this just the game? Why couldn't we have gotten an entire game about trying to navigate the broken reality surrounding a faulty penumbral engine? A frequent literary tip you'll hear is that every story should start at the most interesting part. Well, this is the most interesting part, but instead we only see it at the end. After destroying the engine, a number of minor characters sacrifice themselves to break the necromancer's hold over the storm vault. I think the game meant this sacrifice to be a bigger deal than I thought it was, like it was supposed to be meaningful. But honestly, these guys really only just stood around camp and gave us quests all game, so I didn't manage to get attached to them at all. The effect falls flat. But regardless, we kill the necromancer and we are returned to the plane of Azir to be told that Sigmar is proud of us. Well, that's Tempestfall, the other Warhammer VR game. Yeah, it wasn't horrible or anything, but it was a pretty flat introduction to the universe. If you're already an Age of Sigmar fan and you dream of zapping Sigmar's foes with lightning, I would say this is probably a good game for you. It's probably worth it for you, and probably worth it for like nobody else. Well, that's my little break video before returning to Space Hulk. Decided to pick a VR title this time because, I'm sick and it's keeping me indoors, and I needed a reason to move my body around a bit. I'll have a review of Space Hulk Vengeance of the Blood Angels up in around 3 weeks, so I'll see you then.